You may not know this, but bass fishing is a contact sport. And it's not the kind of contact you'll see on a football field. I'm talking about that invisible link between your rod tip and your bait. That's the contact we'll be talking about today. It's that tension in your line that helps detect a split-second signal that can tell you the difference between dead weight, soft grass, and possibly a monster bass that's about to change your day. Now, beneath the surface, baits speak in a whisper. You just need to understand how to hear them. Today we're going to break down the basic techniques that help you stay connected, and more importantly, when and how to apply them in different situations. Knowledge and technique never arrives in a one-size-fits-all solution. It's generally earned on the water, just one adjustment at a time. So today, take what fits your style, experiment with it, refine it, and keep what works for you. At that point, you cut loose anything that doesn't earn a place on your deck. So for this video, I want you to think of every cast as a live stream of information. Your bait gathers the data, your line delivers it, and your brain decodes it. Now, the second you lose contact, you lose information, and lost information translates to missed opportunities. So before we get into actually demonstrating techniques here, I want to sit down for just a minute and talk about some of the variables that we're going to be facing on a day-to-day basis, because it's really important when it comes to keeping contact with your bait, not only to know the techniques, but know all of the variables that you're going to have to be tinkering with. When you know the technique and when you know all of your variables and all the options that you have, that's when you can really start fine-tuning your technique. We will talk about rods, we'll talk about the length of the rod, we'll talk about sometimes the action of the rod has something to do with keeping contact with that bait. We'll definitely talk a lot about rod angles, tip up, tip down, so on and so forth. We'll talk about line, we'll also talk about the color of a line, because sometimes keeping contact with the bait is not only a physical contact, but it's a visual contact. So keep that in mind. We're going to talk about hydrodynamic resistance. You don't have to remember that word. Basically, it's how much drag a bait has, and that has a lot to do with how well you're able to keep contact with it, the resistance of that bait in the water, the size of the bait, the weight of the bait. All of these are things that you need to be looking at and be willing to tinker with and change when you get out here on the water. Last but not least, we'll talk about weather conditions, we'll talk about wind, we'll talk about current, we'll talk about bottom structure, and we'll talk about boat positioning. And what we'll do now is I'll get up on the deck and we'll start talking about some of the different scenarios that you're going to face out here where you're going to have to keep contact with your bait. Now, today we're going to be focusing in, I should have said this at the start of the program, we're going to focus in on bottom bouncing baits. So primarily we're talking about fishing plastic worms, creature baits, jigs, any type of crayfish imitation, something that's going to be on the bottom. Now the concepts and the techniques that we use can be used for chatterbaits and crankbaits. They vary a little differently, but primarily we're talking about fishing bottom bouncing baits. And I am going to be using just one rod to demonstrate the techniques. The rod that I'm using is a 7'2" rod. It's got a 200 size reel on it. And I am using braided line. I'm using a bright colored braided line. And you have to remember, there is two types of contact. There is physical contact with that bait, and there's visual contact with the bait. So when you are in a place like the California Delta, where you really need to have everything working for you all the time, I really like fishing these high-vis lines. With that being said, using the same rod reel combo, the same line, when I get to situations where I would be changing this out, I'll just let you know maybe I should be using a shorter rod or a longer rod or a different line, a mono or a fluoro, you know, something different. I'll let you know about that. But for now, we're going to go over some scenarios and we'll talk about all the different situations you may be in, so on and so forth. We'll start with shallow water, then we'll work into what we'll do in deeper water. Our first situation is going to be, we'll pull up to, let's say, a flat or shallow water. Maybe we're fishing from the boat to the bank and we're fishing between, I'll say, 1 and 4 feet of water. Today we have a very slight breeze and the breeze is at my back, so the breeze is blowing towards that tule patch up there. That tule patch is in about 1 foot of water. Maybe there's 2 or 3 feet of water, you know, off to the edge, but we're fishing shallow water. First thing is, a general rule is the deeper the water, the lighter the bait, the harder it is to keep contact with the bait. The difference between shallow water, things happen really quick, so you have to process information much quicker. In shallow water, 2 or 3 feet of water, as soon as that bait hits the surface, every fish within 10 or 15 feet of that bait knows it's there. So oftentimes you'll get bites as soon as the bait hits the water or as it's dropping down to the bottom. So think about that. You have to start processing information in shallow water as soon as that bait hits the water. So what we're going to do, the first technique we'll talk about is downwind, fishing with the wind to your back and a rod tip down. We'll throw out and we'll try to keep the bait as close to the water as we can. That wasn't a great cast, but you saw where it landed out there. As soon as it lands, what I want to do is drop my rod tip within about 6 inches of the surface of the water. Now this does two things. It keeps less line between the rod tip and the water. So the less line that you have between your rod tip and the water, the less chance it has to be affected by the wind. Now if I was holding the rod up like this with much more line that's between the tip of the rod and the surface of the water, that's what gives you problems with when the wind is blowing and it blows a big bow in your line. Now we don't have that problem because we've used boat positioning to keep the wind at our back and we're using a wind-aided cast. So if we go downwind and we throw it down there, it's not going to blow a big bow in the line because the wind is blowing the line basically away from the boat. So we're in this situation, we drop the rod tip right down to the water, and that's when we start our retrieve. Very slow, and we make sure that we feel everything along the bottom. So let's go over the cast and the entire situation from cast to retrieve. We make a cast, we try to keep the bait as low to the water as we can to have a splash-free presentation. As soon as that bait hits the water, we're going to drop the rod tip within about 6 inches of the surface of the water. Now I can see my line, it's straight, in a straight line to the bait, a direct contact. At this point, every time I do a slow turn of the reel, I can pop it through vegetation and I can stop it. You want to move it as slow as you can in shallow water. Generally, you want to move that bait as slow as you can at all times, but you have to remember, big pops, big twitches, 2 or 3 reels of the reel handle, that pulls the bait out of the strike zone. And obviously, when we make these casts, we're trying to put it in what we think is the prime strike zone. So once we got it down there and it's on the bottom, we want to move it very slowly to keep it in that strike zone. If a fish is not aggressive, it doesn't pick it up on the drop, we want to give that fish time to come over, investigate the bait, and maybe pick it up and get the bite. At this point, we have physical contact through the line, we have visual contact by watching the line, and as we slowly pull it in, we're looking for that tick, or maybe we're looking for nothing. We're looking for that fish to come and pick it up and move towards the boat. So one of the things that we all have experienced is you're pulling in your bait and you can't feel it. Geez, I don't feel it. It's like somebody cut my bait off. Well, at that point, you better start reeling a little quicker because what generally happens is that fish picks up the bait and it's swimming towards the boat. So that's a situation that because you're trying to keep contact with it and you can't get contact with the bait, you know there's something wrong. So that's going to help you catch those fish that are light biters. The other thing that you definitely have to remember as you bring that bait in, whether you're doing a tip down retrieve or a tip up retrieve, you have to constantly weigh your bait. So if I have a 6-inch Cinco on here and I do this or I pull it, I know what that 6-inch Cinco feels like. And when I'm pulling it and I'm thinking, yep, that's my 6-inch Cinco, I know I can stop it, I can pull it slowly, I can reel it in slowly. Sometimes I'm going to feel resistance. Maybe I'm in vegetation. I got to pop it through vegetation. Or maybe I'm on a rock. Or maybe there's some weight there. When there's weight, you want to slowly move that bait until that weight either subsides or maybe you get that pop, pop, pop. You pull it, you feel a little bit more weight than should be there, then you'll just feel this. At that point, boy, you better drop that rod tip and then set on them. So all of these things you're using to feel your bait, and this is a downstream, wind at your back technique. Now, in this situation, if I'm not catching fish with a 6-inch Cinco, I could drop down to a 5-inch Cinco, I could drop down to a robo worm, or if I'm using drop shot or a jig, I can drop down in size and weight because I can still keep bottom contact. We talked about hydrodynamic water tension or resistance. The bigger the bait, the heavier the bait, the more resistance you have. So geez, that's a terrible cast. But the more resistance that you have, the more pressure you can put on that line to tense it up. I'm hoping that's making sense to you. So bottom line is, if I have a really small bait and no weight, it's very hard to keep tension on the line. The more wind that you have, the deeper you're fishing, the heavier your bait's going to have to be. Maybe the lighter the line you're going to have to use. Maybe instead of, if I'm using 65-pound braid, I might have to go down to 30-pound braid. If I'm using mono or fluoro, I may have to go to, instead of using maybe 12 or 15 pound, I may have to drop down to 6 or 8 pound. So all of these are variables. The other variable that you have, do you have power poles on your boat? Do you have spot lock on your boat? Is your boat aluminum? Does it drift fast? Does, can you control your boat? How are you with the trolling motor? Keeping your boat in position, and not just in the proper position, but keeping it in a position where it's not moving around is also very helpful. So think of all those things. The next thing we'll talk about, let's say you're in, we're fishing the same area here, and we have a crosswind. So we're fishing down here. We can't position the boat so I can fish downstream. I have to position the boat where the wind is blowing this way. And when I lift my line up like this, there's a big bow in the line. Again, one of the things you can do here is either get a heavier bait, but more than likely what you're going to want to do is use a type of alignment, and this works better when you're using fluorocarbon, or excuse me, braided line. I'll throw it out there, and as soon as that bait hits, I'm going to take my line and I'm going to just slap it down into the water, because I do not want that bow to catch any air. So if I throw out and I do this and I leave my line up in the air, by the time I drop my rod, there's already a big bow in the line. So think about mending your line, and you're using this just like a bullwhip. You're taking the rod and you're slapping that line down into the water. So I'll demonstrate it one time here. We'll do this. As soon as it hits, I'm going to drop, or right before it hits, I'm going to drop my rod tip and basically keep that line right on the water. Once the line is on the surface of the water, it can't be affected by the wind. In a situation where you have to use a tip up retrieve, you're probably going to have to start using heavier baits, bigger baits, lighter lines, maybe a shorter rod, because as your rod tip is up here, remember we talked about the distance between your rod tip and the water. A shorter rod, you're going to have less line between your rod tip and the water. So think about all of those things and think about the things that you can adjust. We're going to go over another situation and we're going to talk about a tip up retrieve. And let's just say we've moved on to a different bank. This is not a 2-foot tule bank. Let's pretend that there is a rock bank out there, and whether you're in a lake or whether you're on the delta, that rock bank could come down from, you know, a foot or two to 10 feet, or you could work your bait out to 40 or 50 feet. This is a deep water situation, and in a deep water situation, when you are bouncing along the bottom, it is very difficult to keep your rod tip down, especially with bottom bouncing baits, because what you're doing is you're pulling that bait basically into the rocks, and you're going to lose a lot of baits, whether it's a jig or a T-rig or whatever it is. One thing you could do is go with a bigger, bulkier worm like maybe a 6 or 7 inch Cinco, because this is a bait that's not going to tend to go down in between the rocks, say like a jig or maybe a weight from a drop shot. So when you're fishing these rock walls, think about the baits that you're using. The other thing you have to think about is as you throw it out there, remember we just threw against a rock wall and we're going to be coming out into 10-15 feet of water. You've got to keep your rod tip up. That way when you're twitching it and pulling it back, it's not pulling it into the rocks, it's pulling it up in kind of a hop and drop. So let's go over the tip up retrieve. We throw the bait out. We've got to keep the tip up because we don't want to get our drop shot down in the rocks. And what we'll do is we'll see the bow in the line. Now right now there's not a lot of wind, so I can see that line, and at this point of the game, you're becoming a line watcher. It's still contact, but it's visual contact. You're watching that line, and I don't know if you can see that, but if you can see my line, a lot of times all you're going to see is that's all you're going to see. You'll see the line do this. You've got a bite. That's information that your bait is telling you, that's feeding in through the line, and you have to, see that and recognize it's time to set the hook. Now, in most situations there, you're just going to basically reel in, feel weight, and then, use kind of a swing set. The next situation you may have is you're going to make that cast, and you've got your line up here, and if you have a crosswind, there's going to be a big bow, not just down from your rod tip into the water, but it's going to be blowing sideways, through the wind. That is a very difficult situation. If you can, boat positioning will help you to basically fish downwind with your back to the current, or your back to the wind. If you can't, and you're going to have to deal with this situation, that's when you're going to need to really think about using the smallest diameter line that you could have, so it's the less wind resistant, using a shorter rod, keeping your rod up here. You're going to need to, in this position, you're going to need to maybe use a heavier bait so that you have more resistance, so that you don't have as much bow. There's just so many things you have to think about when that wind comes up and you're fishing deeper water. And maybe the most important thing when it comes to fishing with a big bow in your line, deep water, you've got that rod tip up, you're using a light bait, is to constantly be pulling your rod up and weighing that bait. That's my jig. That's all it is. That's my jig. That's my jig. That's my worm. Feels up. There's nothing there. There's nothing there. What's going on? Reel down to it. You got a fish that picked it up and it, again, is coming to the boat. Now, another thing that you may find when you're casting out, you got your rod tip up. You're in rocks. You're pulling up. You feel something hard. Your weight or your bait may be stuck in a rock. You don't want to give it, a big tug. That very seldom works. If you're in a rock and you can't pull that out, you probably want to reposition your boat, maybe go over the top of it and get that out of there just to save baits. You'll also want to, let's see, what do I got over here? If you're using this technique, you're probably going to want just a very simple bait knocker of some kind. So if you do get hung up, you can go over the top of the bait, connect this down to your line, run it down there, have it knocked off, and go on about your business. Otherwise, you're going to lose a lot of baits. But constantly weigh that bait, know what your bait feels like. You're going to know when you're on soft bottom, you're going to know when you are on hard bottom, you're going to know when you're on rocks, you're going to know when you're coming over wood, and you're going to be able to detect bites quicker. So with that, some of the variables that we didn't talk about are maybe going to fluorocarbon line or going to mono line. Fluorocarbon, as you guys know, has a heavier density than mono, so it sinks a little quicker. That can help you in windy conditions. If you're in deep water, you're probably going to want to go with the fluorocarbon line. If you're in water that has a lot of visibility, you might want to go to that fluorocarbon. Last but not least, you can, if you're here in the Delta, I use a lot of mono line, and it doesn't really affect. I don't feel it affects the way the fish respond to the bait, just because our water visibility here is generally not what it is in a deep water lake. But with that, I want to thank you guys for watching, and try to digest as much of this as you can, and really just think about what we talked about today. Keeping contact with your bait is one of the most overlooked and underappreciated skills that a bass fisherman can have. When you work on this technique and you get really good with keeping contact with the line, you're not only going to catch a lot more fish, you're not only going to get a lot more bites, but you're going to catch the fish that have already been biting that you may have never known about. So with that, thanks for watching. Go out there and catch some fish. Be safe. We'll see you guys on the river.